I'm Martin Murray. I'm the historian at the Arts Club of Washington. I've been a member of the club for about a dozen years. And one of the things that really attracted me to the club was this historic building that we're in. It was built during the Federalist era, so it was not long after the federal city was established here in Washington. If you recall, 1790, Congress passed an act that made this area the federal capital, and then in 1791, Pierre Charles L'Enfant laid out a beautiful plan for the city of Washington under George Washington's instruction. In 1800, Congress and President John Adams finally moved to Washington, D.C., and then 2 years later, a man named Timothy Caldwell, who was a stonemason working in the Philadelphia area, came down to Washington and built this beautiful house that we're in today. It was built in two parts. 1802 was a relatively modest structure. And then a few years later, he decided that he wanted to make it a much bigger and grander house. He wanted to have the handsomest house in the new capital city. And so he built the structure in 1805 that we generally associate with the club, which is the big, large Federalist era mansion that faces I Street. Now, if you look behind me over here, we're sitting in front of a beautiful fireplace. And as an example, I think of the care that Timothy Caldwell took in creating this house, he asked a man named George Andrews, who is a Dublin-born artisan, to create what was called a composition ornament fireplace. It's basically a manufactured material. So you take linseed oil, glue, maybe some carvings of wood, you mix it all together and you put it into a beautifully carved mold. Once the mold sets, you tap it out, and now you have a beautiful ornament that you can attach to a fireplace mantle. And the fireplace mantles that George Andrews did also were in the White House, the original White House. They were in Thomas Jefferson's Monticello and James Madison's Montpelier. So a really fine artisan. Now, the house, when it was built here in 1802, 1805, this was the west end of the city of Washington, not far, of course, from the White House. So we saw a lot of the executive offices and secretaries living over here. Right across the street from us, there was a big market, the Western Market. That was part of L'Enfant's original plan for the city that Thomas Jefferson decided to locate here on the north-facing side of Pennsylvania Avenue. There was also a row of houses just to our west along Pennsylvania Avenue. They were called the Six Buildings. And then another row of houses on between 19th and 20th Street called the Seven Buildings. So this was kind of a lively area, just getting started just as Timothy Caldwell was building his house here. Timothy Caldwell built what he considered the handsomest house in Washington, D.C. And at a certain point, Gideon Granger, who was the Postmaster General under Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, bought the house, moved into it. And at a certain point in 1811, James Monroe became Secretary of State. He had been serving as the governor of Virginia. Before that, he was a minister to Great Britain under Thomas Jefferson, and then under George Washington, he had served as the U.S. minister to France. He was a Revolutionary War officer, so an extraordinarily accomplished person. He came to Washington in 1811, served as Secretary of State under James Madison. Looking for a place to live, well, he rented this beautiful house here at 2017 I Street Northwest. He and his wife, Elizabeth Courtwright, and their daughter Marie lived in the house for a number of years. We had the War of 1812. August of 1814, the British came to Washington and they basically sacked the place. They burnt down the U.S. Capitol and then they burnt down the White House. 1816, Monroe was elected President of the United States, and in March he becomes inaugurated President. Well, when he's inaugurated in March of 1817, there's no Capitol to go to. So he leaves this house in a procession and goes down to the replacement Capitol, which was called the Old Capitol Building. He's inaugurated. Traditionally, the president would bring everybody back to the White House and have a little bit of a party for them. No White House to go back to because it's also being restored. So he brings everybody back here to 2017 High Street and holds his first post-inaugural reception. He and Elizabeth greeting lots and lots of guests. They say that the street was just mobbed with people coming in to pay their respects to the new president and first lady. James Monroe did quite a bit of traveling that summer, visiting different states, introducing himself to the people. And then finally, when the White House was ready to be occupied, which was in the fall of 1817, he and Elizabeth and Marie decamped and moved into the White House. After James Monroe left the house, it was rented to the British legation. So we had two British ministers living here, Stockard Channing and also Richard Vaughan. And then Francis Marco purchased the house. He was the founder of the Institute for the Promotion of Science. Marco rented it to Charles Francis Adams Sr., who was a congressman from Massachusetts just preceding the Civil War. And he, of course, was the son of John Quincy Adams and the grandson of President John Adams. In 1877, Francis Marco sold the house to a man named Cleveland Abbe. He was trained at Harvard as an astronomer and a meteorologist, started working for the U.S. Weather Bureau, eventually came here to Washington, D.C., and he's actually credited with issuing the very first official U.S. weather forecast in the United States. He lived here with his wife, Fanny, and his two boys until, unfortunately, Fanny died around 1908. And then they rented the house out to a school for girls and eventually the Arts Club of Washington in 1916. First rented the house, and then after Cleveland Abbey passed away, they purchased the house from Cleveland Abbey's heirs. And we've been here ever since. In 1916, a group of artists got together. They said Washington is really booming in terms of as a venue for arts. We had a lot of architects coming here during the American Gilded Age. We had the new Corcoran School of Arts and Design here. We had universities blossoming. They were looking to clubhouses that already existed in other places, like in Manhattan and Gramercy Park. We had the National Arts Club. Providence, Rhode Island had the Providence Art Club. So they said, well, why don't we form our own arts club? Basic founders were a man named Michelle Jacobs. Michelle Jacobs was a Canadian-born artist who came to Washington in order to start an art school. He thought it would be nice to have an all-male club, and he was going to call it the National Art Association. Got a bunch of guys together, and they had kind of preliminarily started to form the club. In the meantime, a woman named Bertha Noyes, who was a Washington-born artist trained at the Corcoran School of the Arts and Design, got together with people like Henry Kirk Bush Brown, the sculptor, and his wife Margaret Leslie Bush Brown, Mathilde Leisenring, a painter associated with the Corcoran School, and her husband, Luther Morris Leisenring, who was an architect. And they said, you know, we'd like to have a little bit more inclusive club. The National Arts Club in New York, the Providence Art Club, welcome women. We think we need to have a club that welcomes women as well. Well, Michelle Jacobs and his guys said, well, you know what? Why don't we just all get together and form one single club? They got together on April 7, 1916 in the studio of Henry Kirk Bush Brown and his wife, Margaret Leslie. And they decided then and there they were going to join forces and start the Arts Club of Washington. The Arts Club was going to be a home for artists in all disciplines. So you had painters, you had sculptors, you had musicians, literature people, you name it, you were welcome. In addition, they decided they wanted to welcome people who would be art patrons. Duncan Phillips, whose son eventually started the Phillips Collection here in Washington, D.C., he was a charter member of the Arts Club of Washington, as was Edith Caro Roosevelt. Edith Caro Roosevelt was the former First Lady, Teddy Roosevelt, of course, being her husband. She signed her application form from Oyster Bay, New York, and became a member of the Arts Club of Washington. Over time, the Arts Club of Washington attracted quite a stellar group of artists and people who support the art. One of those people was a man named Hans Kindler. He was born in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. He was trained as a musician. He was a cellist, worked in Europe for a while, then came to America and performed with the Philadelphia Orchestra. While he was playing the cello, he also decided to take up the art of conducting. And he would travel to Washington while he was living in Philadelphia and said, Washington is really in need of its own orchestra. So he and a woman named Mary Howe, who was a composer and also a member of the Arts Club of Washington, got together and they said, let's found the National Symphony Orchestra. Hans Kindler not only founded the symphony, he would often invite fellow musicians to come here. They would either do impromptu music recitals or formal recitals for the club members. He also decided he wanted to have a studio in downtown Washington. So he set up a studio and a private residence here in the club. Back in the day, we used to have studios for artists, and we also had residences for artists.
One of the major events that the club sponsored over the years was what we called the Bal Bohème. It was a very large-scale costume-themed ball. The original Bal Bohème was held at Bush Brown's studio. The first one was called the Bal Grotesque. These events were sponsored by the club, but they were generally held at an outside venue, a hotel ballroom, or some other outside space. So it was a major social event in the city of DC over the years. Another event that the club sponsored for many years was the Washington One-Act Play Festival. The drama committee at the club solicits scripts from across the country, really, and then they were culled down to 5 or 6 finals plays, and then the jury selects the winning play, and then that play is presented on our historic stage at the Arts Club. Just as a historical note, one of the original winners of the Play Festival was Peter Shaffer, who went on to write the Equus play, which was obviously a very big hit on Broadway. We are now, though, this year, for the first time in many years, bringing the One-Act Play Festival back to DC, and the winning plays will be performed at the Arts Club of Washington.
We're here in the Library of the Arts Club of Washington, which is a member-created active library with a full catalog, featuring books by members as well as about members, covering all aspects of the artistic spectrum. The posters behind me feature the book covers of past winners of our Marfield Prize. The Marfield Prize is a very prestigious aspect of the Arts Club's portfolio, and for the last 20 years has been awarded to nonfiction authors who write about the arts. Each year, a winning author is selected by the Marfield Committee and presented here at the Arts Club with both a reading event as well as a special dinner. One thing among many things that is very unique about the Arts Club of Washington is that while it is a membership-driven club, it is also an active arts organization. It has such a rich legacy of highlighting all forms of artistic expression, both dramatic arts, dance, literature, poetry, music, and certainly the visual arts. As they say, the only constant is change. But what's fascinating about the Arts Club of Washington is that we honor such a rich history and such an important legacy while ensuring that our programming and our artistic offerings evolve. We are surrounded by such beautiful reminders of the fact that this is an organization founded by creatives who wanted to ensure a creative hub here in our nation's capital, where interesting people can gather and form friendships.